Hey everybody, how you doing? It's Craig Campbell from Pastor Craig's Cards. And third base is my favorite position. And this year in the Hall of Fame, Adrian Beltre was inducted into the Hall of Fame, so we have a new third baseman to go in. And I thought, you know what? I'd like to take a look at my top five, who I think are the best five third basemen of really the modern era of baseball. And I wanted to represent them with their baseball cards and talk a little bit about their careers and why I have them ranked this way, 1 through 5. And starting at number 5, I have Brooks Robinson. And Brooks is by far and away, I think, the best defensive third baseman ever. He did it during clutch games. He did it all the time. He did it for years. 16 gold gloves for Brooks Robinson. 2 World Series wins. 1 World Series MVP, largely because of his glove. And 1 American League MVP award as well. He played from 1955 to 1977. Had a really long career. In 1977, he only had 47 plate appearances. In 76, he had 218. And then in 1955 and 56, combined, he had 66 at-bats. So really, Brooks's career really kind of spanned from 1957 until about 1975. He had about 20 really good years of playing. And he ended up with 11,782 plate appearances. And more than any plate appearances on anybody on my list, other than Adrian Beltre, who just got inducted in the Hall of Fame. He had 12,130 plate appearances. But Brooks, he ended up with 2,848 hits, just a little bit shy of 3,000. But what's always surprised me is he had 268 home runs. I always kind of looked at Brooks as a little bit more of a power guy, but 268 home runs. And his on-base percentage was .322, and his batting average was .267. Now, there's a stat called OPS plus, and it's kind of a good way to gauge somebody's offensive production. And 100 is a baseline, so anything over 100, that's to the plus side. So really, he had a 105, so 5 points to the plus side. And wins against replacement, WAR is what they call it, which is a lot of people look at that right away to determine somebody's career. But his WAR was 78.4. And Brooks had a great career and just not a lot of power. And all those plate appearances, he still didn't get to 3,000 hits. And he had 28.48, which is awfully good. But I always thought Brooks was a little bit of a better offensive player than he was, but you cannot deny his greatness with his glove. And here's a 1969 Topps, a Near Mint 7, PSA 7. One of my favorite cards. I like the design. I like the smile. Really a clean card. And so I have Brooks Robinson as my number 5 all-time third baseman. As my number 4 all-time third baseman, I have Chipper Jones. And here we have a 1991 Upper Deck PSA 9 of Chipper Jones. And Chipper had 18 years, good years as a third baseman. And he had 10,614 plate appearances, almost 1,000 fewer than what Brooks Robinson had. And he ended up with 2,726 hits, but 468 home runs. He had 200 more home runs than Brooks Robinson. That kind of surprised me. I didn't really think of Chipper as that much of a power hitter, but to have 200 more home runs in 1,000 less plate appearances, that really says something right there. And Chipper, he had a .303 batting average, and his on-base percentage was .401, pretty respectable. And his OPS plus was a 141, so he was 36 points higher in the OPS plus than Brooks Robinson. And Chipper, he did have 1 World Series, and he was a league MVP, and he did have 1 batting title. So Chipper was a good player. I was a little bit surprised that he had 200 more home runs than Brooks Robinson. That did kind of surprise me. My number 3 all-time third baseman is George Brett. And here we have a 1983 Topps in an SGC 8.5. And George was one of my favorite players. He came up in 1974, really started playing in 75. And I was about 13 years old when Brett came around, and they were a good team. The Royals became good, so we saw them on TV a lot. And George Brett was just a great player, a real gamer, a gritty guy, and he had 20 really good years. His first year, he only had 41 plate appearances, but from 1974 to 93, and George Brett had 11,625 plate appearances. So he had about 1,000 more plate appearances than Chipper Jones, and he ended up with 3,154 hits and 317 home runs. And George, of course, had a 305 average, and he flirted that year in 1980 with almost hitting 400. And I remember that I think I was a junior in high school, and I can remember watching every night to see how George Brett had done, if he was going to get to that magical 400 average. But George had an on-base percentage of .369, which was about 40 points lower than Chipper Jones, which is a little bit surprising because George was such a selective hitter. I mean, he was a tough guy to strike out, and he drew a lot of walks. And with that high average, I thought maybe he would have a little bit better of an on-base percentage. But George ended up with one World Series win, and he was an MVP one year. He had 3 batting titles, and he did have 1 Gold Glove. But when I think about George, I think about the eye test, seeing him play many times. And the numbers say one thing, but I mean, George Brett just brought that something extra to the field. He was a force, just his presence. He would change the way a pitcher would pitch, and the way a manager would maybe want to call a game. And George was he was such a good player, just one of the really great players of the 70s and 80s, and I just so enjoyed his career. And so I have George Brett as number 3 all-time third baseman. Now, some people may say, wait a minute, Craig, you got a lot of bias going on here, because a lot of people know that Eddie Matthews is my guy. And here I've got this really nice 1954 Topps, a PSA 6. This would be his third-year card. 52 was his rookie, and then 53, and then 54. And I just really like Eddie Matthews. I like this card. And the thing about Eddie Matthews, first of all, is that he played his entire career, obviously, when the pitcher's mound was much higher. And but of course, he played in a much smaller league, in the National League, and the stadiums were not possibly as good as far as fielding goes. And he didn't really play on AstroTurf, but Eddie was just a great player, and I think the numbers really do show it out. He had 10,101 plate appearances and ended up with 512 home runs. He had 2,315 hits. But here's the thing that kind of surprised me. He had a .271 batting average, but yet he ended up with a .376 on-base percentage. His on-base percentage was higher than George Brett's, which just really surprised me, because I always looked at George as such a selective hitter and a guy that drew a lot of walks. But Eddie Matthews drew a lot of walks. He had Hank Aaron hitting behind him, but I was surprised at Eddie's on-base percentage of .376 for a .271 batting average. And but what's interesting is that Eddie's WAR rated is at 96, which is 8 points higher than George Brett, 11 points higher than Chipper Jones, and 18 points higher than Brooks Robinson. And Eddie just really, with the 10,000 plate appearances and to still end up with 2,300 hits, is pretty amazing. And for a guy that had a .271 batting average, and Brooks Robinson was 276 or 267, I'm sorry, and Eddie Matthews was at 271 for a batting average. But Eddie was a great player, and those 512 home runs kind of separate him from George Brett. And I think his WAR rating of 96 is kind of what seals the deal for me, with Eddie being number 2. And of course, you probably figured out by now, but I have as the consensus number 1 third baseman of all time is Mike Schmidt, and the numbers prove themselves out. Schmidt has a WAR rating of 106.8, 10 points higher than Eddie Matthews, almost 20 points higher than George Brett. He is 21 points higher than Chipper Jones, and almost 30 points higher than Brooks Robinson. Schmidt had 10,062 plate appearances, so he had the fewest plate appearances out of Matthews, Brett, Chipper Jones, and Brooks Robinson, yet he hit 548 home runs and had 2,200 hits. And again, a .267 batting average. He had the same average as Brooks Robinson. and almost the same as Eddie Matthews. But yet his on-base percentage was 380. Schmidt got on base a lot, and his OPS plus is a 148, which just separates him from the crowd. He's 5 points higher than Matthews and 43 points higher than Brooks Robinson. And well, what a lot of people forget about Mike Schmidt, he won 10 Gold Gloves, along with one World Series, a World Series MVP, and he was MVP 3 years. But those 10 Gold Gloves, and I always think, I remember seeing Schmidt play because the Phillies were good. They were on TV a lot in the 70s and 80s. But all those years of playing at the Vet on that AstroTurf, and then playing in Pittsburgh at Three River Stadium, also turf, Cincinnati, Riverfront, Busch Stadium in St. Louis, all those cookie-cutter AstroTurf stadiums where the ball just got on you so quick. True, you did get a true bounce. You didn't have to worry about like playing on grass and getting that weird bounce. You kind of knew how the bounce was going to be on AstroTurf, but the ball got on you so quick at third base. And Schmidt with 10 Gold Gloves. And then I thought about this today. The heat index at those stadiums was just tremendous during the daytime. I mean, sometimes it'd get up to 120, 130 on the field. That AstroTurf would just bake. And to be able to stand that game after game during those summers and still produce offensively like he did and in the field is just amazing. And I think it's pretty clear that Mike Schmidt is the best third baseman ever. And this 1974 card, I believe this is something that I probably opened up. I've had this card probably since I got it in 1974. And unfortunately, it's just a real bad miscut top to bottom. And I really do need to upgrade my Mike Schmidt collection. And I think that's one thing I'm going to be looking to do here during this year in 2024. But Mike Schmidt, I've got him as the #1 third baseman. And I'd love to see your replies to this. I'd like to see who your top 5 third basemen are. Since Joe Mauer went in the Hall of Fame, who are your top 5 catchers of all time? Todd Helton, first baseman. Who are your top 5 first basemen of all time? I'd love to see your list of the 5 along with the cards and just a little explanation of why you have them ranked the way you do. And so many good players to choose from. I love the hobby. This is what brings the hobby kind of to life to me, is when we talk about the players and we think about the players, we reminisce about them. And it's just such a fun hobby. And I just love all the interaction on YouTube. And I look forward to hearing your comments. Have a great night.